You know, it's been hard to build in Los Angeles for a while, for over a decade, for a long time, right? We started the slow growth movement in the 80s, and we've continued making it harder to build ever since. But other cities are catching up. It's getting harder to build in Houston than it used to. It's getting harder to build in Atlanta and in Phoenix and in Las Vegas. And a lot of these cities find that they're running out of land that's easy to build on. I don't mean to say they're running out of land, they can always expand, but the land that people actually want to live on, the land that the city will let you build on, is dwindling. And that means that those kinds of cities are starting to catch up to the problems that we've been experiencing here on the coasts.
This is Maestro Minute, the show that discusses all things real estate, sharing interviews with the most successful people in the industry. Hear from their perspective and what they are doing to achieve success. Get exclusive tips on how you can also succeed in real estate. Maestro Minute is brought to you by Maestro Development. Here's your host, Nareg Muradian.
So that leads me to our next item here on affordability of housing and the lack of affordability, especially here in California. Where are rents and prices, and where are they growing? Where are they declining? Where do you see that market going?
Yeah, there's a terrible affordability crisis. We all know that. It has spread. So it is no longer just in the large coastal cities. It used to be that if you talked about an affordability crisis, you were mostly talking about New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, et cetera. During the pandemic, we saw prices surging all across the country. This is not new, though. I just released an interesting new paper with a colleague, Chris Redfern at USC. We published it in Real Estate Economics, and we were comparing all the major cities in California to Texas. And the reason we did that is because California and Texas are light years apart in terms of politics. So we thought, here's apples and oranges, and let's see whether they really have very different housing markets as a result. And what we found is that they're actually a lot more similar than you might expect. From 2014, long before the pandemic, to 2021, which we kind of defined as the last big housing boom that we saw, the trend lines in all those markets overlapped. There's no big difference between California and Texas. Now that wasn't true in the boom before that. When we had the so-called bubble in the early 2000s, prices soared out of control in Los Angeles, and price appreciation was pretty muted in Texas. Now those lines are right on top of each other. All of these cities, Houston, San Antonio, Sacramento, Los Angeles, all are acting similarly, which means something is changing so that this has become a national crisis. And the thing that's changing is it's a supply problem, and the supply problem is no longer just Los Angeles's problem. You know, it's been hard to build in Los Angeles for a while, for over a decade, for a long time, right? We started the slow growth movement in the 80s, and we've continued making it harder to build ever since. But other cities are catching up. It's getting harder to build in Houston than it used to. It's getting harder to build in Atlanta and in Phoenix and in Las Vegas. And a lot of these cities find that they're running out of land that's easy to build on. I don't mean to say they're running out of land, they can always expand, but the land that people actually want to live on, the land that the city will let you build on, is dwindling. And that means that those kinds of cities are starting to catch up to the problems that we've been experiencing here on the coasts.
Yeah, they also have a capacity issue. They can only do so much workload, right? And they only have so many people. And I think there needs to be a spur in government hiring to help release some of that capacity. You know, in Los Angeles, there's a lot of city workers, but I'm curious on what your research showed on how long it takes in LA to get a project from beginning to end.
It's gone up over time,
right? And you can pay it. I know on our projects, like we look at paying expediting fees, which will help, but you might lose that saved time on something else down the road. So
there's a bottleneck in city planning, right? And I don't mean to call out the planning departments. In all of the approvals process, I'm just using planning as a general term. There's a bottleneck.
Right.
And it's not necessarily their fault because, like I said, city budgets are stretched thin, so they can only hire so many workers. But one way that we were able to detect that bottleneck was when we showed how the time to build changed over time. We went back to the mid-2000s, and then we ran the clock forward. How long did it take to build something in 2007, 2008, and so on, all the way up to today? And yes, it's gone up over time, but it actually went down after the Great Recession. Projects got built faster in 2010 and 2011 than they did in 2008, and then they did in 2014. Why? That looks like progress for once. Why did it suddenly become easier to build faster? It's because it's the same time when prices had collapsed and production had collapsed. People were sitting around at their government offices with nothing to do. Of course they could approve projects faster. So that's how we know that when the market gets hot, there's a bottleneck there. When the market weakens, we can actually build faster.
I'm curious, what's your perspective economically? What's the rent control perspective from an economic standpoint, kind of on a macro level?
On a macro level?
Yeah.
I have to think about rent control macro. It's so different city by city. I think the macro issue is that rent control is spreading, right? It used to be that rent control was only a few cities across the United States, but in the face of this affordability crisis, lots and lots of cities have been adopting new rent control statutes. And when I say rent control, we should be clear that what we mean by rent control in this latest generation is really more rent stabilization, which means you regulate how fast owners can raise rents, the percentage growth. It doesn't mean you put a hard dollar cap on it. So just so we're clear for everybody out there. But that's an interesting way to tackle the problem because it doesn't tackle the fundamental underlying problem. It'll help some people, absolutely. I've done some work on rent stabilization recently, and we've looked at the numbers, and there are lots of people who are living in rent stabilized units who are paying lower rents than they would have otherwise, and that's great for them. However, the underlying problem is still a supply problem.
Right.
At best, rent control is only helping a small portion of the population. And the problem with the way that rent stabilization is designed in places like Los Angeles and the rest of California is that it has a feature called vacancy decontrol, which means that if I leave an apartment and you move into that apartment, you're a new tenant, the landlord can now give you market rate rents. There's no control over what they charge you. They can charge you the sky's the limit. The only thing that benefits you is the longer you stay in the unit, the more you benefit because the percentage increases are capped. But the moment you move out and somebody else moves in, they raise it right back up to market rate. And so there is some good research showing that a lot of people barely benefit from rent stabilization because of that way that it's designed. You have to live in the unit for many years before you really start to feel a benefit, and most renters move every year or two.
Right. Well, from a development standpoint, if you have rent control, it's harder to make the profit margins and pencil out, right?
Yes. And so there are a lot of studies on this that show that when rent control is put into place in cities, we tend to find that landlords cut back. They spend less money on their buildings because if I'm going to try to maintain my profit margins and you're going to cap the amount of rental revenue that I can earn, simple, I just won't maintain the buildings. I'll just let them deteriorate. And so housing quality goes down. And there's a lot of negative side effects. Now, you know, I have a lot of friends who support rent control, and it's because they're stuck in a situation where they can't come up with a better policy because we're not building more housing. But if we could build more housing, we wouldn't need to resort to these sorts of policies that also have negative side effects.
Thanks for tuning in to the Maestro Minute Podcast. Make sure to rate this podcast if you found it helpful, share it with a friend that could use it, and follow us on all major podcast platforms. The Maestro Minute, powered by Maestro Development.